Hello folks, this is video 2 for labor unions and strikes, and here are your objectives for video number 2. We're going to start off by kind of thinking about the question, why did organized labor begin in the first place? And so the first thing that you need to know is that robber barons during this time were American businessmen who acquired a fortune by ruthless means. So they were known as really greedy and corrupt. They rigged the market and they developed monopolies. And so some examples of these robber barons are Cornelius Vanderbilt. He owned the railroads. John D. Rockefeller started a oil company. J.P. Morgan was a banker, and Andrew Carnegie had a steel company. And so these men developed great vast amounts of wealth. You can kind of see here where they were living. And they did this by creating monopolies. Now, a monopoly is when one business has complete control over an industry's production. And what this does is it controls wages and prices. So think about this. If Apple were the only cell phone manufacturer out there, the only one, none of these existed, Apple could charge as much money as they wanted for a cell phone. They could charge thousands and thousands of dollars because they don't have any competition that kind of drives their price down. And so this is what happens in monopolies. So here are the three kind of things that you need to know. We see prices are much, much higher when there are monopolies. Wages for workers are much, much lower. And overall, it just creates an unstable economy. So another reason why labor unions kind of began in the first place was these awful working conditions that people were experiencing. So for instance, child labor, I'm sure that you know, was very prominent during this time. So we've got kids as young as 6 years old making about 27 cents a day. They would be physically punished for not working fast enough or arriving late. And of course, they didn't get any breaks or sick days or vacation days. Oftentimes, they were working really long hours, sometimes up to 14 hours a day, up to 7 days a week. So these working conditions were not just for children, though. These were for everyone.
Stephanie Dan, call the front office. Stephanie Dan, call the front office.
Adults had poor wages as well, and suffered all of these awful working conditions. And something else too is that it was actually very unsafe in a lot of these factories. So there was one testimony that it was so dusty in a factory, the person working there couldn't see, and all of the dust got into their lungs and they couldn't breathe. And oftentimes you would see young people and men working in really unsafe mining situations. So why were these bad working conditions even existing? Well, this is because it kept costs down for the owners of these factories, right? It costs money to make your factory safe. It is expensive to pay your workers a decent wage. It's expensive to give breaks and time off, right? And so the labor pool was so large at this time, there were so many people that were looking for jobs that they could easily get replacements. So these are the three reasons why we see the rise of labor unions. So the rise of robber barons, monopolies, and awful working conditions. And a labor union is an organized group of workers formed to protect their rights. Because of these awful working conditions, labor unions kind of posed these solutions here. So how can we fix these problems that we're experiencing? Minimum wage, 8-hour work days, vacation and sick days, safer working conditions, and then no child labor. So the first union that we're going to talk about is the American Federation of Labor. This is led by a guy named Samuel Gompers, and it is comprised of just skilled workers. And they focus on things called bread and butter issues. So things like wages, benefits, pay, hours, and working conditions. They were willing to use strikes, but they were a very conservative union, so they focused more on negotiating and bargaining. And this was actually the biggest union in the country at one time, with over 500,000 members by 1900. But it is important to know that only white men were allowed in the American Federation of Labor. The industrial workers of the world were actually quite different. This was comprised of skilled, unskilled workers, white workers, African Americans, women were admitted, and they were much more radical and they believed in striking. They did focus on those bread and butter issues that I mentioned previously, like wages, working hours, and benefits, but they wanted to change the entire economy from a capitalist society to a more socialist society. So once labor unions emerge, we see them start fighting for their rights across the United States. And as they start striking, a lot of these strikes turn violent across the U.S. So we're going to talk about 4 in particular. The first one is the Great Railroad Strike. So in 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut their workers' wages for a 3rd time in West Virginia. And so we see those workers kind of walk off the job and stop working. And then this strike really spread across the entire country. We see state militias come out and fight gun battles with these strikers. So it becomes violent very quickly, and federal troops are forced to come out and restore order after about 100 people were killed. So damage was actually more than $10 million at this time. And the result of this is the public was completely shocked at this violence, and they thought that labor unions looked like menaces to society, like they were violent, radical people. The Haymarket Riots, the second one you should know. So this was a nationwide strike in support of an 8-hour workday. And in Chicago specifically, we see police kill 4 Chicago strikers. And so this radical came in and threw a bomb in the middle of the strike. This killed 1 officer and wounded 6 other police officers. And so, of course, this created another gun battle between police and workers, and about 100 people were injured. About 4 people were executed for their roles in this Haymarket riot because supposedly they are the ones that planted and detonated the bomb. The Homestead strike was at a Carnegie steel plant, and workers at the steel mill striked because they were faced with a 20% wage cut. Andrew Carnegie then locked out his employees instead of letting them come back in and tried to bring in replacement workers. He hired this organization called the Pinkerton Detectives to kind of provide security. Think of them as like security guards. So the strikers actually would become violent, and they didn't let those replacement workers to come into the mill. And so again, we see a gun battle happen. Several men on both sides were killed, and there were tons that were injured. And eventually the state government sends in troops to stop the violence again. So, and this strike then does collapse 4 months later. The last one that we're going to talk about is the Pullman strike. The American Railway Union was a part of this. In 1893, this Pullman company, they were responsible for building passenger railway cars. They laid off workers, and then they slashed the wages of the workers who were still there. So as a result, these workers were unable to pay their rent for company housing and the high prices charged at company stores, right? So the owner of the Pullman company was their landlord and also owned all the stores around as well. And so after the company refused to discuss the workers' problems, a strike began. And so to show support for these Pullman strikers, we see members of the American Railway Union across the U.S. refuse to use Pullman cars. And so what this basically does is shuts down the railroad for some time. And as a result, a federal court, under direction of the president, forces the strikers to stop because they need the railroad to keep operating. So we see federal troops come in to resume that railroad service instead of protecting the strikers' rights. Okay, that is it for this video. Good job, folks.